Well, welcome to Impact Thursday night. My name is James Trevette, and we're going to do a little teaching now. And I sort of hate to break the flow because the teaching that I've got is not all that spiritual tonight, but it's something that I felt led to discuss. I think as I've talked about in the first of the year, I like to go back and do a prophetic update to sort of see where we are, the "you are here" picture. And of course, we're talking about, will Jesus return in 2015? And we've somewhat answered some of those questions, of course, since then. This is part 3 of that discussion. And we're just going to take a look at something called the Shemitah, because there's just so much out there that's going on right now. There's a best-selling book out there by Jonathan Cahn, talks about the Shemitah and the things that are coming forth. So naturally, as a teacher, I wanted to go in and take a look at it and just have an understanding of what this is all about. So we're just going to take a brief look at this. And it may be a little bit mathematical or technical, but I think it's there to prepare us for what's to come. So let's move into discussion. And first of all, there are key Bible time cycles that we need to look at when we're talking about when things happen. We know that there were 7 days of creation, and on the seventh day, God rested. Therefore, we have 7 days in a week, and on the seventh day is a Sabbath day. And the same thing's true in years. There's a 7 year called a Shemitah, or a Sabbath year. And then if you have 7 Shemitahs and add 1 to it, you come to what's called a Jubilee, which is also a Sabbath year. And then we have the 7,000 years of creation, with the 7,000 will be a Sabbath millennium. So I believe God has a pattern in His timing, and He wants to let us know how this works. So we're going to sort of follow through on this and look at the Shemitah. The Shemitah is the last year of the 7-year cycle. That's the Sabbath year. In this year, the deaths are released and the land lies fallow for rest. In case you haven't noticed it, that really hasn't happened a whole lot. And we could go into how the Jewish culture handles that, but I think we'll just go ahead and talk about it, the Shemitah, for now, and not go into that. So this year is 5775. It's a Shemitah year according to the Jewish calendar. It runs from September 25th, 2014, through September 13th, 2015. So that's from Rosh Hashanah to Elul 29, and then, of course, the next year is the next day, Rosh Hashanah. So when I say the Shemitah year 2015, we're really talking about from the last quarter of 2014 and the first 3 quarters of 2015. So that's the way we count Jewish time. Is everybody familiar with that? Okay, then we can just move right along. It comes out of Deuteronomy 15, 1 and 2. It says, "And at the end of the 7 years, you'll make a release. And this is the manner of the release. You'll release the hand of every creditor from what he has lent his friends. He shall not extract from his friends or his brother, because the time of the release for the Lord has arrived." So every 7 years, you release the debts, though it does say, though, of friends and family. And I think that could be used liberally in certain situations, but Leviticus 25, 2 through 4, also talks about a rest for the land. "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you shall sow your field, and 6 years you shall prune your vineyard and gather in the crop, and during the 7th year the land shall have a Sabbath rest, a Sabbath to the Lord. You shall not sow your field, nor prune your vineyard." So the Lord has set up this cycle of Sabbaths. And a lot of people talk about, well, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. But there's also a Sabbath year. And it's also holy. So this particular situation, you release the debts, which is done on the last day of the Shemitah year. But the rest for the land, of course, is for the whole year. 2 Chronicles. We're going to look at 36, 15 through 21. "And the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by His messengers, because He had compassion on His people and on his dwelling place. And what this is about is God is talking to Israel. And he's sending a word again and again to them that it's time to repent and return to him. Because he has this compassion for his people and the dwelling place of Israel. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. And I want you to see this because this is the key to me to the Shemitah. God is doing his best to say, return to me. And if you look at the things that they were doing, unfortunately, I can see a lot of that happening right now, even in this country. So therefore, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword. Now, the area of Chaldea is actually Iraq, parts of Iraq. And it actually looks somewhat like the ISIS crowd as you read this. They slay the young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, had no compassion on the young man or the virgin, the old man or the infirm. He gave them all into his hands. So it's a difficult situation where the Lord has turned over the situation now. And all the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and his officers, he brought them all to Babylon. They then burned the house of God and broke down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all its fortified buildings with fire, and destroyed all its valuable articles. And those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and his sons until the reign of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete. So what I'm showing you here is this judgment of the Sabbath that comes upon a Shemitah year. To me, it's really not as much about the Shemitah year as it is turning away from God. And that's what's happened here. They turned away from God, and he's using the fact that they have ignored 70 Sabbaths of years. And he says, I'm putting you in this bondage in Babylon for these 70 years. So I believe the judgment was because Israel would not repent and return to God, even after the prophets were sent. The Sabbath year, the Shemitahs, were used as a measure of the judgment. So as we go forth and we look at this, because it seems to be that the judgment is coming because we're in a Shemitah year. But the judgment isn't coming because it's a Shemitah year, it's coming because we turn away from God. And I personally don't believe, in our case, it is necessarily a judgment as much as it is a warning. So let's look at Ezekiel 4, the days of the lost Sabbath years, to try to understand, what do you mean 70 years, 70 Sabbaths? Well, he's talking about Ezekiel. He says, lie also on your left side and lay the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of days that you lie on it. You shall bear their iniquity. And I have laid on you the years of their iniquity according to the number of the days, 390 days. So you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And then when you've completed them, do they do this now? Has anybody done this as a prophet? I mean, for America or anything like that? I guess back then, prophets did some very difficult things. So then, they had to lie again on your right side. Then you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah for 40 days. I've laid on you a day for each year. So I guess being a prophet was very difficult back then. So if you look at it, that turns out to be about 430 years total that they basically have to pay for. But if you look at the Shemitahs, you say, well, wait a minute, in 430 years, at best, there may be 61, possibly 62, depending on how it worked out, Shemitahs. So that doesn't add up to 70 years. So where's the problem? Well, the problem is that the Shemitah isn't the only Sabbath year. The other 9 have to do with the Jubilee. So you must consider the Jubilee when you're looking at this thing too. So the Jubilee says, you shall count 7 Sabbaths of years. That's what, 7 times 7? For yourself, 7 times 7 tells you that. And the time of the 7 Sabbaths a year shall be 49 years. The math looks good. Okay so far. Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, the day of atonement. And you shall make the trumpet to sound throughout all of your land, and you shall consecrate this 50th year and proclaim liberty throughout the land, all of its inhabitants. It shall be a Jubilee year for you. So there is another Sabbath here, and this is the Jubilee. And it seems to indicate that it would be after 7 Shemitahs on that last one, the next year would be, in this case, a Jubilee. So if you add that in with the 430 years, you say, well, just simple math, that works out to be the minimum of 8 Jubilees with a 38-year remainder. So if there was a Jubilee within the first, say, 37 years or so, you actually got in that extra one, and it added up to 70 years. So that must have been the situation. So you see, God not only counts the Shemitahs, but He's going to count the Jubilees also. So I can't see that He would take one and ignore the other. I think they're both very important. So as we looked at it in Deuteronomy in the Shemitah, at the end of the 7 years, you'll make the release. Release the hand of every creditor from what he lent his friends. So the way the Shemitah works is at the very end of it is when the release is supposed to take place. Of course, the land's supposed to lie fallow for the entire year. But then comes time for the Jubilee. But the Jubilee, if you remember, the issue was at the beginning is when the proclamation took place. It was during Yom Kippur or the Day of Atonement. So still, the whole year was important to lie the land fallow. But that's also important as we look. The last day of the Shemitah year is the release of debts. This day is Elul 29 on the Jewish calendar. It's the day proposed by Jonathan Cahn as the day of financial calamity. But it could also be Rosh Hashanah the next day. And I'll explain why. Because in Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish tradition, Rosh Hashanah, which is the next day, the first of the year, emphasizes the special relationship between God and humanity. Each year of Rosh Hashanah, all inhabitants of the world pass before God, or pass under the rod. So there's an evaluation that takes place. It goes on. It says they pass under the rod like a flock of sheep, and it's decreed in the heavenly court who shall live, who shall die, who shall be impoverished, who shall be enriched, who shall fall, who shall rise. But this is also the day we proclaim God King of the universe, which fits very well with the return of Christ on that day. So, in a way, Rosh Hashanah is a day of judgment. So, if you look at Elul 29 and Rosh Hashanah, I'm not sure which is the actual day. One says, okay, you didn't obey Elul 29, but the judgment seems to come on Rosh Hashanah. So passing under the rod just comes from Ezekiel. He says, as I judged your fathers in the desert and the land of Egypt, so will I judge you, declares the sovereign Lord. I will take note of you as you pass under my rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. I'll purge you of those who revolt and rebel against me. Then you will know that I am the Lord. I expect that He's going to do that on His return. So this is just sort of laying it out. So let's look at this. This is the 2008 Dow Jones. You'll notice about September 11th it starts dropping. Well, September 11th would have been exactly 7 years, of course, after the Trade Center, the World Trade Center financial towers collapsed. So exactly 7 years to the day, all of a sudden now the financial system starts to collapse. Should that be a surprise? Should we understand that possibly God may have something happening here? And it may have started here, but the greatest day here was actually on Elul 29 when the Dow dropped 777.7. But you notice it also continued to drop all the way to Yom Kippur. So there was definitely something happened on that year. But can we say that it's because of the Shemitah? Well, there definitely was something that happened 7 years before that. But let's take a look. First of all, we got to understand, when are the Shemitah years? Does this really line up? The Jews count the Shemitah from creation. Therefore, if it's evenly divisible by 7, it's a Shemitah year, starting from the very beginning. So, actually, you can take 2015 is the Jewish year 5775. You divide that by 7, and it comes out even. So, according to the Jews, sure enough, this is a Shemitah year. And if this is a Shemitah year, then so was 2008, and so was 2001, when those calamities hit. But Leviticus 25 shows that the Shemitah year should be counted from the entering of the land of Canaan. So there's another question here. Is that really the right Shemitah year? So Leviticus, speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, when you come into the land which I shall give you, then the land shall have a Sabbath of the Lord. Let's assume that entering the land of Canaan was a Shemitah year. See, when you come into the land. So that, let's assume that that worked out. Let's assume that the Jewish calendar does know what it's talking about. And very possibly, those two did line up. If that's the case, and this is a Shemitah year, then we should see a pattern. So I'm an engineer, so I tend to say, let's look at the data. So let's look at the data. Well, this was a Shemitah year, and yep, there's the crash. 7 years before that, in September of 2001, on Rosh Hashanah was the big drop. Rosh Hashanah was 383 points. So it does look like something's happening. So let's go a little further. If this is true, then it should be happening as a pattern. So I looked, and sure enough, these are all Shemitah years. There is a little blip there, too hard to see on this type of scale. A little blip there, you can sort of see it on there. There is a little blip there. And there's a big blip here and a big one here. So if this is true, if that truly is a Shemitah year, then there's a pattern here. And it pretty much validates the fact that there's something going on. Now, I look at this pattern and I say, I can't help but notice, yeah, there may be blips here, but I see also a very increasing slope. So yeah, you're having a hit here, but then all of a sudden, you have a really good year, and then maybe another blip and a really good year, and a blip and another good year, and it gets better and better. So it makes me wonder, is something big going to happen here? If the slope just continues to increase, is it going to continue to do that? Is it building up to something? Could this really happen? Well, you say, well, what's the U.S. got to do with the Jewish calendar? Well, one thing is possible is the U.S. was dedicated to God. I think you all know this, right? Back in 1789, George Washington in New York City, which is at ground zero, if you've read Jonathan Cahn's other book, you understand that he said a couple of things. He said, no people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the United States. So maybe the United States did dedicate itself to God. He says, the propitious smiles of heaven can never be expected on a nation that disregards the eternal rules of order and right, which heaven itself has ordained. We may be doing that right now. We may be disregarding some of the eternal rules set forth in the Bible. So I don't know. What I'm doing here is I'm basically saying, is this real? is there evidence that shows that something's happening? Now, is it the Shemitah? I don't know. But what I'm seeing is there is something happening here. And it does seem to follow a pattern. And it does seem like more of a warning than a judgment. Because when a judgment comes, things don't recover quite the same way. I mean, judgment usually takes something out pretty well. It doesn't then pretty soon start up even better. So I believe that it is possible that there's warning signs coming. So my belief is if the Shemitah is being used by God in America, it would probably be as a sign or warning to return to God. If the Shemitah is being used by God as a sign or a warning, then the Jubilee year also must be used. So let's take a look. As you see, I said, let's see if there is a pattern. So I went back, and this scale, it makes it a little bit easier to see. But you can see that these seem less, and well, maybe there was certainly some downtimes here. But you notice there's a pretty drastic increase going up here. But you can see where these things hit. It's hard to see some of these little things in here because there's actually a spike here. But there is a little bit of drop here. Here it gets more and more severe as we go. So you can see, though, in each one of them, if you look at the day, there was a downturn on that day. But you can also see that it certainly did not stop the increase. So maybe it's a warning. It certainly couldn't be a judgment, or we certainly wouldn't be doing this good. It doesn't mean that something's not coming. I extended it on out just to take a look. Sure enough, 1931, which was the big crash after the 29, that was a Shemitah year, and I looked at it, and sure enough, there are down times here, but overall, the pattern is not as clear. You can sort of see a pattern here, but it certainly does get much clearer over these last few years. Now, Jonathan Cahn also mentions something called a solar eclipse. In some years, he says the solar eclipse occurs on Elul 29. He says, in the past, this has ushered in the worst collapse in Wall Street history. What will it bring this time? Again, as before, the phenomenon does not have to manifest at the next convergence, but at some time, and again, it's wise to take note. So he's saying that during this time, that this shows yet a more critical time. Well, let's look. Here was a solar eclipse coming in 2015. He's saying that there was something very bad happened back here in 1987, and something very bad happened back here when it happened again back about the time of the big stock market crash back in 29. But I took a look at this and said, well, let's take another look at this one in 1987 because you really can't see it clearly. But if you see it, yes, it did have a big crash here, but if you'll notice, it built up this whole year and then took the crash back. So overall, I wouldn't call it disastrous. It comes up, it increases, and increases again. So yes, there was a crash, but it actually was not on Elul 29. As a matter of fact, Elul 29 was the biggest single day point gain ever. And the reason I'm bringing this out is it's very easy to write a book and to put a bunch of facts because something goes wrong every single day of the year. If you want to prove that God is judging America, it wouldn't be that difficult. You can come up with something that went wrong. But you could also come up with a case that maybe God's blessing America because things are still going up. So the actual crash didn't take place till 26 days after the end of the Shemitah year. So I'm not sure what this means. I'm not sure that that's the true case. And I just want to bring to you guys the case because what it's saying is something serious is going to happen sometime this year, according to what he's saying. Let's look in Leviticus 25 again. So you're to count 7 Sabbaths of years for yourself, 7 times 7 years, and this is the Sabbath for 49 years. You're going to sound the ram's horn on the Day of Atonement. You'll consecrate the 50th years and proclaim a release. Each of you shall return to his own property, and you shall return to his own family. So not only are you releasing debts, but in this one, you're releasing slaves and land. So to me, this sounds like it's possible a time when the Lord might return, when the Jews are rightfully given the land back that God gave them after his return. For it is a Jubilee, and it shall be holy to you. So the question is, when is that Jubilee? If the Jubilee year is counted from creation, as was the Shemitah, I took a look, and it turns out the Shemitah, the year for Jubilee is 2022. Could that be the return of the Lord? It's actually the Shemitah year, 2023, but it's at the very beginning of that year, remember, which is in September of 2022. And that's if it's counted from creation. There's other ways it could be counted. What about when they entered the land? Well, there's now an estimate that says, really accurately, we think it's 1446 BC when the Exodus occurred. 40 years after that, they entered the land of Canaan, which would be 1406. But it turns out 1406 is not a Shemitah year. If I go with one of the 2 Shemitah years, it turns out that it's either, it rolls up to say that the actual Jubilee, once again, is 2023, or possibly, because instead of 1406, I've got to use 1409 or 1402. If it's 1409, then it's this year. If it's 1402, then it's 2030. In either case, interestingly enough, it's exactly 3430 years, or 70 times 7. Remember, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people. 70 times 7. Yes?
James, if we are under grace and not under the law, then how does this apply to us? Because that's what we preach in the church, that we're under grace and all this thing under the law.
Oh, I love it. It would apply if we can see that God is giving us a warning, because whom he loves, he chastens. So that's why I say I don't see it necessarily as the judgment at this point. There will come a time of judgment. It's going to come. We know that. We say, well, Lord, why don't you come down here and judge this mess and straighten all this out? You know what his answer is, right? He says, I am. I'm going to. So that's the way I see it, OJ, is that, yeah, I understand that we're supposedly under grace and everything's great and he loves us and all of this, but what if? What if he does chasten whom he loves? What if there are things still going on today and God is still dealing with issues? What about you? Does he deal with issues in your heart? Do you ever have a situation that may just be a warning for you? I mean, I understand. I know where OJ's coming from. He says there's a grace message here that says everything is just fine. Don't worry about a thing. Just come in. I'll tell you how great you are, and that you go out. But the God has not changed. He's still the God of the Bible. But he loves us. And I believe that he's trying to tell us something. The whole thing is let's take a look and see if something's happening. And let's talk to God. And if he's looking for prophets, it might be a good time to volunteer. So let's just take one quick look at this and finish up here. So we're looking at the possibility here that 70 times 7 Jubilees could work out to be this 2023, or literally 2022. That's one model. There's another model that says, wait a minute, if we look at the Balfour Declaration, and then we look at when Israel became a nation, And we figure that out, and maybe that's a model for when the Jubilee years came, because, gee, it sort of lines up. So, fairly complex chart, but what I'm showing here is that there's 3 possible times here. This 1918, 67, and 2016, in which case, next year is a Jubilee year. Creation model and Exodus both seem to indicate that, gee, it just might be the 2574 and 2023, or it's possible from the Exodus model that it could also be 2030. So what about that? If I take the one that's most likely of these, I would say it's 2023. If that's the model, and this is indeed the model of the Jubilee year, and that's when Christ returns, then you are here. That means that this is the year that the peace treaty is going to get signed, and it's going to kick off the 7-year clock. So we're going to know pretty quick. It could be. And the reason I'm laying this out is to show you it could be. I'm not saying it is, but I want you to consider that it could be. And if it is, you've got to reconcile some certain things in your mind. We have with us a young one here, and you're saying, well, what about the prophecy spoken over him if the Lord returns? These will be fulfilled. Prophecies are going to be fulfilled over the youth, even if it isn't in this season. We don't know after the return of Christ and we go into a new kingdom, those things could be fulfilled then. So we don't know all of the things. But all we know is, I believe personally that there are no disadvantages to the return of Christ, any more than there's no disadvantages to salvation. And we should look expectantly at the return of Christ, because everything that happens will be good for us. Maybe we endure some things. Christ had to endure some things, but he was rewarded greatly for it. And we might be also. But if he's coming soon is not a bad thing. But is the church really saying, is the church in the Spirit saying, come? Or are they saying, hold on, can you wait a little while? So we've talked about that. There's no need to fear this. This is a good thing. It's time for this world to be straightened out, and only the Lord's going to do it. And it is possible that the clock could be started, which is the 7-year peace treaty. And once it starts, that's it, according to the Scriptures. So this is possible. So as we look at it, the Jubilee, it shall be holy unto you. It could be the return of the Lord. Each of you shall return to his own property, and each to his own family. That could be the return of Christ. My thoughts? Well, 2015 is definitely a year to watch and pray. We should keep a close watch on the Israeli-Palestinian peace talks. That'll tell us, because if we get that treaty and it fits the scriptural things that we've been talking about, that could start the clock. If Netanyahu's defeated in March, that could accelerate the peace talks. Watch for a Psalm 83 war in the Middle East this summer, if the Iranian nuclear threat gets critical. Financially, I'd prepare a stock market exit strategy for this summer. If you have money in the market. Pray and be ready to bail out when God tells you to. And that's just wisdom. So, is it possible we're building up to something? Well, I noticed that it actually starts dying here before the Rosh Hashanah on both cases. So maybe we'll see something happen even before that, if this is the year. But there's a pattern here, whether it's the Shemitah or not. What must we do? Recognize the signs. Stop being fearful and pray for God's perspective. Prepare a financial and a family survival plan. Be about your Father's business. Volunteer, and I mean volunteer unto the Lord. I'm not talking about, go down to the shelter, which is fine, and volunteer there. But I'm talking about, Lord, use me. I don't want to miss this. Prepare for difficult times. Trust in God. Form a body of believers for support. Got to have that. Go all in with God. When these things begin to take place, stand up, lift up your heads, because your redemption draws nigh. Could be. And there's a lot of things to take into account here. I'm just trying to present some evidence. You go to God and see. But is there a pattern here? Yeah, there's some sort of a pattern. And just get excited, because it could be. It could happen. The Lord may return soon.